Welcome to my channel, Delightful Stories. I'll be happy if you subscribe to my channel and like it. Enjoy watching and don't forget to leave your opinion in the comments about the story. The small kitchen was lit only by a desk lamp. The smell of food had long since ceased, and perfect order reigned on the table. Only the drying plates and the still wet sponge next to the sink were reminders that the room was used for eating, not for the purpose for which the girl sat at the table with her hands on her head. Sleeping at the table was uncomfortable, but it wasn't part of Vendy's plan. She just didn't notice once again how she dozed off in such an uncomfortable position. It must have been the similarity of the environment to night duty, when the same leaned into sleep, and periodically only a long-learned habit, forced at the right time to get up, wipe sleepy eyes with her hands and make a round of the chambers. And now she woke up. She looked sleepily around the surroundings and immediately realized that she was not on duty, though it was better there, because there her tears no one saw or heard. But here the tears sprang from her eyes. She saw the pamphlets on the tables with all kinds of tempting bank offers. Consumer loans, and supposedly installment loans, all the same bondage. And in their situation with the children, so at all bondage with uncertain prospects, both in the near and distant future, does not sleep. My son's voice made me wake up and look familiarly at the figure of someone in yellow-orange pajamas. Chose such a color of bright life lovers that now, every time, everyone in the house shuddered when they saw him in it. Why not in bed? Mum, but that's what you start. The teenager reached out like a contented cat, stepped to the kettle, flicking the switch. Taking advantage of the fact that he was turning away, Vendy discreetly removed the pamphlets lying on the table with her hand and quickly pushed them under the breadbasket on the table. We've been talking to the boys, so... The teenager hesitated, not turning to face her. Vendy had a bad feeling about this. What did you talk about? What did you talk about? That it would be better if you turned us in. Not for good 6 months, a year. A girl a year younger than Dan came into the kitchen and was just like him, except for the long hair, which was loose around her shoulders. Or if you give permission to use me as a donor, not you. The word used struck like a slap, forcing the woman tighter, clenching her teeth. Nancy didn't know what she was talking about. Yes, bone marrow is not a liver or a kidney. But at the same time, even such an operation could do serious damage to a teenager's body. And that's if we don't think about the fact that predisposition to any kind of cancer can be hereditary. And if Dan was diagnosed with leukemia, Nancy could just as easily have it. No, she won't think about it. She won't let those three think about it. By the way, I don't see the third one. And no, it's like they conspired to catch her three in the kitchen and try to explain their point of view. They think they're adults, smart, able to cope with anything, to find a way out of this supposedly simple and understandable situation. Except that this is only in their words was so simple and understandable. And in practice, do you realize that if I give you away, then I cannot give you back, knowing that you have to spend 4 to 6 years in an orphanage? She wanted to say in a fit of temper that you forgot how after they took you out of the orphanage, you cried every night, not even waking up, and you forgot what trace even at a brief stay there leaves deep inside. Vendy knew she hadn't forgotten. She herself still can't forget, even though more than 15 years had passed since she had left the boarding school. Nor had she forgotten her friend, who 2 years ago, dying, asked only one thing, that Vendy, the only person close to her, not to abandon her 3 children. And she did not abandon them, and now they themselves are in all seriousness offering to abandon them now. Who do they think she is? Who do they think she is? Who do they think she is? Her mother. We all know we're not little kids anymore. Machel, the most impulsive of the 3, came very close. And before Vendy could stop him, he pulled the ill-fated pamphlets out from under the breadbasket. And what are these? We understand too. If you will be on you and work we still this loan. And even after the operation is all, we have already lost one mother and do not want the second. It's better if we never see you again, but we know you're alive. The boy choked on his words and squeezed his eyes shut, clearly to keep himself from crying. Vendi had done this herself often as a child, and she knew very well that this was not the right time or place to pry, to reassure him. So she only glanced at the boy who had decided to run out of the kitchen, thus escaping the conversation, and then turned to the two remaining children. That's it, my understanding ones. You won't be young when you're each 18. Until then, I'm responsible for you. It will be me, not you, who will make the decision, assessing all the consequences. And it's not up to you to tell me what to do. Do nothing and go to bed. Someone has school tomorrow. Unless I'm confused, which I'm not. The kids were still angry and looked at her for a couple of minutes with some strange anger in their eyes, but they didn't say anything. Unlike Ali, who had fled earlier, but were also in a hurry to get away as quickly as possible. Only when she heard 2 claps did the woman drop her head in her hands and still let her tears flow. If only someone knew how worthless she felt. All the things that had seemed like hell to her before, her studies in med school, the brutal competition for a good position at a private clinic, and even the contemptuous attitude of her colleagues after she'd taken on these 3 orphan monsters. All this seemed so insignificant compared to the feeling of her own helplessness and inability to keep her word. Nonsense, that's enough. She could handle it, she could stand it, and she would keep her word. No matter how hard it was, no matter how much more she had to endure. Everything will be all right. She'll take out a loan. She'll have Dan's surgery. She'll be a donor herself. And nothing will happen to her. If nothing had happened in the orphanage during her hungry and practically sleepless student years, she would survive now. She was not sugar-coated. She would not melt. The 2 of them were always together, even like each other. It was as if they were sisters, relatives, only their characters were complete opposites. Vendi was pushy, grasping everything on the fly and able to handle any difficult situation, and Minnie quiet, calm, behind in half of her school subjects. But at the same time unusually hard-working and accustomed to rely on her sister in everything they did not have, as the other girls in the room, to fight for a place to get comfortable, to play music, to spite each other, or tear each other's hair because of the guys. Even the kindergartners and teachers were amazed at how well they got along and how problem-free they both were, especially compared to some of the students in the same orphanage. Although both had mothers who were alcoholics who died at about the same time, though under different circumstances, Vendi was burned alive when he didn't put out his cigarette butt. And lucky then, little Vendi was playing outside in a distant yard and wasn't home at the time. And Minnie, the mother, had a vodka trip while she was sitting with the nextie, was a little bit drunk with my drinking buddies, and I talked about life. They both remembered everything, albeit vaguely, both Vendi and Minnie. Sometimes they talked about it, but they didn't want to talk about their mothers. Maybe because they didn't remember the good stuff, or maybe because they never had any affection for them, and it didn't matter to them. No mothers, no fathers. No one even tried to look for them. Both girls had a dash in the appropriate box. So they had only one road to the orphanage, where they lived almost to adulthood. It was to be expected that after the orphanage, their paths would have diverged. An excellent student, Vendi went to study nursing after 9th grade, and Minnie, after failing every possible exam at the nearest technical school, went to study chef at the nearest college. But the friendship didn't go anywhere, although there was simply no time for communication at times. Because of the constant studying Vendi and unexpectedly established personal life. Mine, however, they say, if nature takes away from a person some quality, then in return also gives something. For example, a happier fate. While Vendi because of her constant employment, has blown all the guys away. Minnie has managed to settle her personal life very quickly. Lucky, as they call it, turned out to be quite nice the first time. Alex ended up being good not only in words but in deeds. And it was not only that the guy, being only 5 years older than Vendi and Minnie, had managed to settle down relatively well in life, but also that with regard to his mother, he never allowed himself too much. At first, though, Vendi kept a very close eye on the life of the young family. What could she do? She was used to protect her, and at the same time she knew firsthand what such successful, enterprising people were like at home. But Alex did not even think to behave like these characters, did not reproach Minnie with money, lack of work. On the contrary, he offered her to stay at home and do only the housework. At the same time, he did not intentionally complicate her life. He was also the first to mention his desire to have a child, and not just one, but 3 children, by all means. Minnie was in agreement, and Vendi watched the young family and concluded that they could relax. A friend was in good hands, and in those same good hands, Dan, Nancy, and Michael, with whom she sat for days on end, Minnie and, of course, Alex. After work and Vendi races to visit, always took an active part in the education of children. Because help was always needed, a newfound mom of many children to play with the children, while she pays off, go to the store, and give her own quiet run of the stores, without the 3 cranky children in their arms. Vendi and Alex did all this. They even became friends while raising the little ones. And then Alex disappeared. Minnie kept repeating time and time again, both in interrogations and in conversations with Vendi herself, that it was business as usual. Drove the kids to school in the morning, on his way to work at lunchtime, and called to say he would be late. This happened a lot. Lately, the bosses had changed at work, and Alex, as one of the prospective managers, was hoping for a promotion, so sometimes he stayed at work 2 or 3 hours overtime. Minnie understood and did not scold her husband, just asked to warn him, which he did. And then he didn't show up 2, 3. 0 later, not late at night, not early in the morning. Those days were imprinted in Vendi's memory, every second of it. She had nightmares about it all, shaking with terror and unable to say a word for tears, frightened children ready to burst into tears, constantly asking questions about where Daddy was. The smirking cops who refused to take statements saying, "Go home, miss. Your husband will go for a walk and come back." And there was no explaining it to him, that Alex hadn't been out all this time. He couldn't get drunk anywhere because he hated alcohol almost more than Minnie and Vendi put together. And he didn't have a mistress because he loved his wife and only saw her. Everyone at work shrugged it off too. Yes, he stayed late, then said he was going home excited or scared. Didn't act out of the ordinary. Had no conflicts with co-workers. And then only 3 days later, the co-workers. And then only 3 days later, the police got wind of it. But it was too late. They only found the car in the river, and the body was swept away by the current. A year later, he was declared missing and buried in the cemetery with an empty coffin. The children had seen enough detective stories with a twisted plot, and unanimously decided, Daddy is alive, but he's hiding for some reason. And neither Minnie nor Vendi had the strength to explain to them that Alex's body is just at the bottom of the river, where even divers with their equipment can't climb in order to find it. Maybe, though, it was even better for them not to know it and not to understand it. Vendi, even with Minnie's consent, decided to support this game, sent them birthday presents in the mail on Alex's behalf, didn't argue. When they started talking about Daddy coming back someday, and then somehow it just went away on its own. The kids realized they would never see Daddy again, and never mentioned Alex again, and then Minnie got sick. The doctor said that it was all to one thing, and health was initially not the strongest in 3 children one by one, but also stress, and so much more. She died in a matter of weeks in a transient form of cancer. No one had time to do anything, to understand anything in time. And then, as they say, the autopsy showed everything. Dan and Michael were immediately taken to the orphanage, and Vendi followed them through all the circles of hell. There was a lot she could have said to the custodial staff about the notions of ethics and morality of the latter, but she was not accustomed, weak to utter such words. What she had not listened to, and about children she had known since birth, and all teenagers were difficult, and she could not take them into custody and would not be able to cope with them, and no one would marry her with such a burden. Everyone felt entitled to voice their supposedly valuable opinions, which Vendi had absolutely no interest in. The foster parent school application, several commissions in a row evaluating both Vendi and her place of residence. As never before, she was glad that she managed after the first 3 years of work, literally for next to nothing, to exchange her one room from the state on a 3-room apartment with a history. And then everyone dissuaded her. Like, do not dare to buy an apartment where there was a drunken stabbing and the corpses were carried out. How that grandmother, whose neighbor had been in the grave for a long time, tried to enlighten her. The spirits of the dead will return and take revenge on the one who disturbed their peace. Of course, as long as Vendi lived in that apartment, she had never seen a single spirit. But she paid for the apartment in 3 years, and in 2 more years, she cleaned it up. And such that the custody officers, passing through the rooms with their tongues, were satisfied to cut off and eventually gave her children under guardianship. Only half a year spent in the orphanage did not stay there for long, and now they were telling her to give them up. She can't, and she won't. And it was not a promise, but the fact that in the 2 years that they had spent together, these children, Vendi had begun to think of them as her own. And they started calling her mom almost immediately. She even wanted to adopt, but the same guardianship office dissuaded her, explaining that after this procedure, no benefits from the state will not have to wait. And the benefits, unfortunately, were needed. Vendi's salary was good, but even on that, the 4 of us she wanted to make a living from bread to water, and she still wanted to provide her children with a normal childhood. Not an outfit, a second and one-button phone for 3. And in school was not the same as in her days. At least one computer in the family had to be, so they could use it to type reports and projects for school, and to look for information on the internet. And what was going on in distance learning, it's scary to remember. And again, Dan carried everything neatly, so I didn't have to buy anything. But you can't wear money to school from a brother's shoulder. Bags, things, equipment, all this Vendi bought, including from the manuals, though consistently providing all the receipts. And each time she met with the inspectors, provoking them to just another round of praise. Like, you take good care of the children, and then there are such guardians who drink the children's money or spend it on themselves. It was beyond confident comprehension. How could it be? No shopping, no manicures, no haircuts could be discussed with her. All the things others could afford to spend money on. But there was no getting away from the judgment behind her back. Like, why did you take 3 of them? And how should I have taken 1 or left them all there? And of course there was sympathy from others. Maybe Vendi never found herself either. Yeah, well, no wonder. Vendi was even beginning to enjoy herself in some way, responding to the offer to meet with the short phrase, "I have 3 children." By golly, it worked on potential suitors just as well as the spray can she and many used to walk around town with when they were teenagers. Of course, there were still people who didn't mind meeting her sporadically and purely for health, and were even willing to pay gifts for these meetings. But because of Vendi's upbringing, these people were not interested. Sighing, the girl began to study the brochures again. However, the choice was already made in favor of a well-known bank, where she had taken out a mortgage only a few years ago, and her payroll cards were in the same bank. So things will be easier with all the documents. Well, and the interest Vendi on this, hopefully, will still be lower, though not declared in the booklet of 5 per annum, of course. She went to the bank the same morning, took the children to school, with the punishment of calling the older man if he suddenly felt unwell in class, and immediately went to implement the plan, took a ticket, and decided not to stand in line like other people waiting for an appointment with a specialist, but to sit on a sofa next to the cash register. The benefit of that electronic scoreboard in time displays numbers of tickets, to which the turn came service. Absent-mindedly, Vendi glanced along the line, now and then snatched vaguely unfamiliar faces of people, until suddenly she noticed Alex in line at the cashier. At first she couldn't believe her eyes, ashamed to admit it, but she only noticed Alex in this man when he turned to her sideways and her face became visible. It was almost impossible to recognize the old acquaintance in this rustic-looking guy. A different haircut, face, gait. Everything seemed to have changed except his appearance. For a moment she even thought what she saw was absurd or a play on her imagination. She even reminded herself of how a recent acquaintance had confused her at times. But an inner voice wailed she was not mistaken. It was Alex standing there like nothing had happened. "Well, hello there." She walked right up to the guy, folded her arms across her chest, and began the conversation with this mundane line. "You don't miss your kids. You're a dead man who's been away from young children. Why should I be ashamed? Look, my name is James. I have no idea what kids you're talking about. But anyway, let's not talk about all this here." "Well, come on. Let's go out." Vendi shook her head and was the first to leave the bank building. The self-appointed James followed her quietly and made no attempt to escape, which was good because Vendi had no idea exactly where to look for the guy if he did decide to run away. "You called me Alex." The man began the conversation, sinking first on the bench. Vendi sat on the other edge and began the story as briefly as possible in this situation. "Alex, my friend's husband, went missing 5 years ago. The body was never found. He left her and her 3 children behind and disappeared. The police think he drowned with the car. The car was found, but he wasn't. And then I see you today and you're seriously telling me that you're some kind of James. Maybe you have a James passport, too." "No. Long story. Look, I almost drowned 5 years ago. I got a head injury. I don't remember anything since then." The man switched to you, clearly taking after Vendi. "But my mom said it turns out she lied to me." "You come out of nowhere, and you're telling me the truth. And why should I believe you exactly?" The confusion in the boy's voice was suddenly replaced by about the same kind of anger that Vendi's voice had before. "You don't believe me? See for yourself." She readily took out her smartphone and in 2 clicks found the right folder with the pictures, shoved it under her nose and began to comment on each photo the guy had entered. "That's what I clicked with you and many at the birthday party. You weren't signed yet. Here we all went to the lake together. Here's Dan from the maternity hospital." And here the boy seemed to have stopped hearing her voice by the second minute of studying the contents of the folder. He just mechanically flipped through the pictures, staring at himself with some kind of detached, invisible gaze, and then suddenly dropped the smartphone and leaned down and grabbed his hands on his head. Vendi didn't immediately realize what had happened, and when she did, she immediately rushed to him, holding his shoulders with her hands to keep him from falling forward. He didn't fall, but instead he piled on top of Vendi, and he mentally called that shelf in the bathroom a bad word. She had roughly understood what was happening to him now, so she didn't ask stupid questions or raise a shout over nothing, and that would only make Alex feel worse now. Instead, the girl picked up her smartphone and got ready to call an ambulance just in case. What if this all turned into a full-blown optical seizure? Or if something worse happened? But nothing worse happened. The man took a couple of minutes to catch his breath and then pulled away from Vendi and somehow settled down on his side of the bench. "Do you want some water?" The girl readily reached into her bag. She had made a habit of carrying water since the first time she'd taken very young Dan for a walk. Children had grown out of the age when suddenly on a walk they were thirsty, and the habit still remained. The man nodded and greedily dipped into the offered bottle in 3 gulps, drinking half of it. Then he turned to her as if he didn't know what to say. "Did you remember something?" She clarified. He looked at her with such an angry look that she thought for a moment he was about to throw his fists at her. But he didn't. Alex just thought for a moment and nodded. "Remembered enough to know you weren't lying. I also remembered why I ended up in the river." And the man wanted to say something else, but he grimaced and pressed his left palm to his temple. His too pale appearance suggested to Vendi that he would be left to faint now, which was no surprise. "Sorry, I didn't think it could end this way." In her mind, she scolded herself with the last words. She should have prepared the man, made sure he didn't get hurt if anything happened. After all, they were on the street, not somewhere safe at home. "You put your brains in the right place and now you're apologizing. You know, I didn't understand you very well before. And now my head is all messed up." "What?" The girl knew they couldn't talk about everything calmly on the bench. So she made what seemed like the only right decision and invited Alex home. "The kids are at school. They had at least 6 hours, just enough time to discuss everything and exchange the news." Alex agreed, and there was a bit of a jam. It felt like a person was not really here now, but there 5 years ago, the day something terrible had happened, of which she was still unaware. Vendi was on her way to the apartment. Alex said to her back, not daringly uncertain, as if he was afraid of something. It was already clear from the questions what it was. "Why do the children live with you?" "Where many?" "Died almost 3 years ago." "Cancer." It sounded too dry, but Vendi felt that if she told it any differently, she would break into a trivial hysteria over everything that was going on. A convulsive sigh behind her back was the response to that remark. And then Alex immediately changed the subject of the conversation back on the stairs, starting to tell me what had happened that ill-fated day. Opening the door of the apartment and letting the man inside, Vendi led him into the kitchen. She poured hot tea for both of them and listened. I had to get into the books on a business matter, but I found that the figures didn't add up a bit. Then I talked to my colleagues and heard a couple of conversations. But in short, we have one of the pillars, along with an accountant and a man from the procurement department, implemented a scheme of theft, which is so easy a cursory look at the reports did not reveal. The old director, apparently, was in the cut, so he did not check documents more closely. But now there is a new one. Anyway, I went to him with these figures. I showed him the screenshots and recordings of conversations. Let me guess, the new director was in on it too. That's it. He and his goons met me on the highway, took away my phone, beat me up, and threw me into the river. No chicks, as they say. And then I opened my eyes in another place, and there was a typical village house, and my grandmother was sitting by the bed, asking me, "Do you remember who you were?" And I can't even say anything. And she's just crying. Yeah, she throws herself on my neck, saying, "James, my son." And you believe her without proof. With skepticism in her voice, Vendi said, "You know, I wasn't in a state to engage critical thinking. And according to my mother, that is, the grandmother's story sounded logical. They said that the son had come of age, served in the army, and then went to Moscow and got involved with criminals. And then he was put on the missing persons list. Although in fact it is clear what happened to him. And suddenly I appeared on the doorstep of my parents' house with my brains blown out and no documents. Well, at least he was alive, right on the doorstep." Vendi could not stand another logical inconsistency. She said that by the river she found me, called for help, a couple of men from the neighborhood, and they are the same as her son. That is, they did not go to the police or the hospital. She said she could not know why a man was hit in the head and who would hunt for him if he suddenly found out he was alive and stayed at her place. And all the villagers were unanimous. James, apparently the truth with him, looks at least a little bit like him. Maybe they've forgotten what James looked like. I'm 37, he'd be 30. One now, if he'd left home when he was 18, not a soul has seen him in 13 years. Alex put his empty mug on the table and looked at Vendy. How about a smartphone for a minute? Or a computer for the same minute? Yes, please. Unlocking the screen of the phone, Vendy readily handed the device to the man. He ran his fingers over the central screen as if there had been no break for 5 years, and he seemed to be satisfied with the result. I have my file. What would have happened to those records, though? You said they took your phone, but I'm not stupid. There were a bunch of cloud servers to store everything only on the phone. And I didn't tell them myself, that there were a bunch of copies in the cloud. Honestly, I only did it for the sake of keeping the data. In case I lost my phone or broke it unexpectedly by the law of meanness. In a situation like that, you would have been better off copying the folder to one of your buddies. If I had known they were going to kill me for that, that's exactly what I would have done, the man assured her. Except that I didn't think they would take a man's life for that kind of money. It's a few tens of $1,000 a month, not $1 million. Of course you get jail time for that, but for attempted murder and conspiracy, it's a lot higher, believe me. And the slash, where they will now sunbathe, will look even less like a resort. Where do they exile economic criminals? You just have to think about how to do it so that you don't get caught and not put you at risk. After all, if these freaks wanted to kill me to hide everything, the man did not say, but her friend, in her former voice, understood the way he was thinking, but for some reason she was not frightened herself. Probably because she knew exactly what to do. I have an idea. Or rather, I have an acquaintance from the prosecutor's office. That he's honest as time, tested. Well, if you ask him to take over your case, I think he won't say no. All the more, he won't spoil the statistics at once, and you're all set. The economic crime is solved, and the criminal investigation is on a platter. And your disappearance can be discounted. Talk to him. There was no question as such in Alex's question. The woman merely nodded. Well, I'll have to get my papers back then. He didn't finish rubbing his temples with his hands again. Listen, Vendy, do you have any Analgin? My head's killing me. I'll get some. You can lie down for a while. My room is free. I have to be on duty at night. I'll have to go home, but I don't mean home. Where will you go in your condition? Said Vendy. Well, I don't know exactly where you live, but something tells me it's 5 or 6 hours. It's a long bus ride, but you're in the middle of... No, but you said yourself the kids are going to be home from school soon. And anyway, that in general, when they come, you'll get to know each other again. What am I going to look like? Listen, let's take a rain check. I'll come to my senses for tea. I'll buy some toys. Or what are they interested in now? But just imagine they now come in, and there is actually a man I do not know. They say, hello. Kids, I'm your father. I also remember how my father used to leave my mother and me, and then he would bicker the same way. And he was very offended that I didn't love him, and didn't throw myself on his neck with shrieks of joy. And I don't want to be in his shoes. Vendy shrugged her shoulders in general knowledge of Alex's family. He had never made much of the fact that both his parents were drunkards. And if the mother still took care of her only son between bouts of drinking, the father led an immoral life, so immoral that the mere mention of him made Alex shudder every time. You're not in his shoes. What happened to you isn't the same as disappearing with a bottle in your arms and some queen at a sleepover for 5 years. But and they'll understand just fine. They're smart. If you don't remember, and sometimes too much, She shuddered, remembering the conversation last night when the teenagers were seriously proposing that they be put in an orphanage. I don't doubt that. Alex swallowed the pill and gulped. He drank a glass of water, trying not to move his head too much, made himself comfortable at the table, and dropped his head on his hands. Just as Vendi had sat the day before, contemplating the prospect of taking out a loan. Oh no, definitely a loan. The meeting with Alex and all the revelations that descended on the woman made her completely forget about the primary purpose of the morning visit to the bank. By the way, Vendi, what were you doing at the bank? The question made the impression of an exploding bomb. Vendi was silent, at a loss for a couple of seconds, and then very quickly decided, no, she's definitely not going to talk about that. Alex, for today, enough of his revelation about the death of many and unexpectedly returned memories of the past. We have problems. I'll tell you about them later. You go get some sleep now, she said in an irreconcilable tone. Even on the sometimes stubborn teenagers, that tone had no effect. So Alex was about to object, got quiet, and went to the room specified by Vendi. For a while, she sat next to the already sunken man. I don't know why myself. And then the lock on the front door clicked, and the hallway filled with cheerful children's voices shutting the door. From her room, Vendi walked out into the hallway and told those to be quiet. She didn't have time to prepare to talk about Alex and everything else, so she decided to speak as she always did, as they always discussed problems and difficulties in the family. No lies, no unnecessary sniveling, no telling who should do what or how to take the information. The children listened silently to her story without interrupting or asking clarifying questions. Only when Vendi finished speaking, Machel, stunned, exhaled and said, "Why the hell do you watch your language?" Nancy's brother immediately twitched. He and Dan looked at each other warily, and apparently it was the older one who decided to ask the unspoken question, hanging in the air. "What's that supposed to mean? He's going to take us now." There was somehow no hint of the joy in his voice that expected to hear Vendi. "It turns out I did. Well, not right away, of course. At first he'll have to get his papers restored, get a job, in general, until he proves to the guardianship that he is mentally and physically all right. No one will give you to him. But after he has gone through all this bureaucracy, you will go back to him." "We will? Is that what you think?" "Yes," the girl said seldom. "Doesn't anyone want to ask us? Why should they? We are children. It's like puppies or kittens. The one who took it is the daddy," Dan answered in the same tone. "You're just going to give us to him." "Yes," Alex joined in the argument. "That's how it is. You said it yourself this morning. What? And you are just going to give us to a total stranger. I won't put you in an orphanage and give you to a stranger. But Alex, your father. Yes, we don't remember him at all, and we don't know him. Mom, what if he's crazy or something? And I'm a girl and he's, well..." Nancy shrugged, frightened. "You know, there's all kinds of fathers. Do you remember what happened in the next town 2 years ago? You were the one who taught me not to get into cars with men I knew, and not to go anywhere with them, and with women too, but especially with men. And now you're the one who says they'll take us and give us to a stranger. That's how everyone kept quiet. Don't make him out to be a scoundrel," Vendi said firmly. "As you just said yourself, you don't know anything about him. Or rather, you don't remember. And in the time it takes him to get his papers back and look for work and do all that bureaucracy, you'll have time to get to know him. And if it turns out to be bad, which I doubt..." She didn't finish. But judging by the silence in the kitchen, the children realized that they were not perceived as puppies or kittens and would not be given to just anyone. One less problem. Speaking of problems, she should have been getting ready for work by now. Which means that the night the three will spend with Alex, who still does not know when he will wake up after all this experience. Fortunately, The three teenagers did not resent the fact that an allegedly strange man would be sleeping with them in the next room. So Vendi was going to work quietly, leaving Michael on kitchen duty. It was a tradition they had had almost immediately after Vendi took the children out of the orphanage. They were so eager to help her and do everything themselves that she thought it a good idea to teach them how to do chores and assign them to each of the trio. It was better in order of priority than waiting until one of the helpers decided to take apart a socket or do something useful in quotation marks on his own. My head ached from the impact. Water was pouring down their throats and noses, and his arms grew heavier with each attempt to surface. He couldn't make it, he couldn't do it. Someone shook me by the shoulder, as if pulling me out of the dark, murky water. I instantly jumped up and saw a vague, dark silhouette in front of me. It was not even clear whether it belonged to a woman or a man. As soon as he was on his feet, the silhouette darted out the door of the room and rushed out, leaving Alex alone with his own thoughts and his surroundings. Night. Vendi said she was on duty. So it wasn't Vendi. Who was it then? Was it one of them? I had to summon up all my courage to go to the door and somehow, fixing my hair on my head, walk out into the common hallway. No one. But a soft light streamed in from under the kitchen door, and quiet, indistinct voices could be heard. Feeling his courage evaporate with every step he took, the man reached the door and opened it slightly. The conversation was immediately silenced, and three pairs of eyes, with a strange mixture of curiosity and fear, stared at him. The boys immediately stood next to each other, somehow stealthily shifting the girl behind their backs. "Hello," he said with a challenge in his voice, said the younger one, folding his arms across his chest. "Hello." He didn't even try to smile. He knew it would look completely false and inappropriate. "I guess you don't remember us either." The guy who was practically as tall as him, the oldest in the group, stared at his face with an examining look. "A little I was when it happened, you were." He showed his hand the height of the eldest. Then he waved the same hand. "If I'm not in time, tell me, I'll leave." He understood, unlike his father, that no one was obliged to rejoice at his return home several weeks, or even years later. And he understood roughly the range of emotions the children were feeling right now. Yes, everyone is mitigating the circumstances under which he disappeared for 5 years. That's where Vendi was right. But the children's psyche, and his own admittedly, couldn't explain that here they were, the four of them, one family. To them, Vendi, the family that had been there for them all those 5 years, helping to solve problems, carrying custody. And he was a man they knew so little, whom they only knew from old photographs. And he didn't know them at all. Nancy was 8 when it happened. And back then, he knew all about the fairy classification, could retell the content of every episode of his daughter's favorite material, and also feel sorry for her after a fight with another girlfriend who turned out not to be a girlfriend at all. And so what to talk about now, with the girl standing across the street? Alex didn't understand. "It's a bad time," Dan said slowly, "but not to throw you out at night. Sit down, would you like some tea?" "I'd like some tea, too." "And it's all right to speak as you, if I may, of course." He sat down on the offered chair, and the teenagers sat opposite. They were clearly cramped and uncomfortable, but they intuitively preferred to stick together against him, no one taking the risk of sitting next to him. "Who woke me up?" The children looked at each other and were demonstratively silent. "I was dreaming." "That's what I thought," Dan shrugged. "That's how we scream in our sleep. The first months out of the orphanage." The girl poked her brother in the side with her elbow in a familiar motion and blushed, but she didn't say a word. But Michael entered the conversation. "And you? Did they really throw you in the river?" He elbowed her, twice from his sister and twice from his brother. And silence again. "Really?" Alex answered. I see Wendy told you everything. Well, yes, we have it in our family. We do not lie and do not hide anything. Otherwise it happens that the truth is not told, and a man makes up things for himself. It's a good tradition. If you observe it, you can tell what Wendy forgot today at the bank. She said you had some problems, but she didn't have time to tell you what they were. At this point, he twisted his heart. It was as if Wendy didn't want to tell him about the problems now. Either she was afraid for his condition, or she was sorry. It was unclear. The children looked at each other. Nancy shrugged her shoulders. Michael looked at his brother and sister, unsure of what to say, and Dan was the first to speak. I was found to have leukemia. The stage is still small. So you can transplant bone marrow from a suitable donor and forget about everything. But if we do it one at a time, we'll lose time. So my mom decided to take out a loan. I'll help. I have money, even if it's not much. I work unofficially, of course. But the more so that after the restoration of documents and official work can be found, it is unlikely in the specialty. But money is not the main problem. Unexpectedly said, found suitable possible donors. Me and my mom, you know, and she doesn't want it to be me, considering that she already takes a lot of extra shifts at work so that we have more money enough for everything, along with the loan, you know, how it might end for her. If you really want to help, convince her to either donate me or put us in the system for medical reasons. That's entirely possible. It was thrown into the system as easily as Alex felt his heart clench, as if in pain. They were too mature, even considering that Wendy had protected them as best she could of their typical orphan fate. They reasoned too calmly about things that children their age shouldn't have a clue about. Concerns should be different at 12-14. First love twos in classes, fights with teachers, street pranks, and a spanking for the first attempts at smoking. Anything but this. Flat out surrender to the system. Pronounced so simply, as if it were such a normal way out of a situation, to surrender your own child to an orphanage. Yes, Wendy's children are not by blood. But there's a lot more to it than that. He knows that the woman who took him in is not really his mother, but for some reason he cannot stop thinking of her as a person closer to him than that perpetually drunk woman, whom he would rather forget and not remember. There's a better way. Donors are chosen by their blood type. As you remember, we're all O positive. So there's a good chance I'll be a match and I won't have to donate anything. And I'll help you pay off that loan. If necessary, we'll sell our house in the country and buy an apartment somewhere in the suburbs. The difference there should be enough not only for the operation, but also for a normal rehabilitation. We already offered my mom to sell the house, but she would not sell. Like, when I will be 18, then the three of us can sell it or burn it or do whatever we want. And she would not be in charge of our property. Michael clenched his teeth tightly and turned away for a moment. First she teaches us that life is more valuable than money and houses and things, and then she herself. The boy didn't finish. Judging by the trembling of his shoulders and the fact that he was in no hurry to turn back, it was better not to disturb him unnecessarily. We shall find a way out anyway. I don't know how much help I'll be, but I promise. I won't go anywhere else and I won't leave you. I believe you. The children said it in one voice, and then they looked at each other confused, and then Dan spoke for the three of them again. You're the only one who can keep us from Mom. I can. He tried to make it sound calm. After all, it was to be expected. Yes, it's very painful to know that your children see you as a stranger. But what did he want? He'd been gone for 5 years. And anyway, who cares how they perceive him? What matters is what he can give them as a father. After all, it was his direct responsibility to look after the children, provide for them, and give them some kind of upbringing. And that's certainly what Wendy has been doing for the past 3 years. The case of financial fraud at Alex's firm resonated unexpectedly. It's understandable. It's one thing to steal and quite another to take someone's life. And the fact that this man miraculously survived for 5 years, lost his memory, and then returned to punish his abusers, and completely made Alex the Count of Monte Cristo of local origin. It got to the point that they began to recognize him on the street, which sometimes made the man extremely angry. However, the anger wore off when he remembered the results of it all. There was something to be happy about, wasn't there? First of all, the owners of the firm had paid Alex a very impressive sum of money, both for exposing the swindlers and partly for almost losing his life because of his search for the truth. That sum of money came in handy because it made it possible to get by without a loan for Dan's surgery. But Wendy had to add to that money almost all of this month's salary and a few thousand from the piggy bank set aside for a rainy day. And Nancy had a chance to go to school in Dan's clothes, but the girl herself wasn't the least bit embarrassed. And the adults were glad that they managed to avoid at least a fourth loan, which would have had to pay back several years. The second piece of news was also good news for Alex. The owners of the company not only paid him, as they said, compensation, but also invited him back to work at the company, and with a promotion, which at one time so sought by the promising manager. Of course, there were some difficulties of his own. Nights he was studying a lot of documents in order to remember what he had forgotten and what he was not used to for 5 years. After all, the fact that he had been given a chance did not mean that he would continue to be in the same place if he was worse than the rest of the staff, right? And then there was the third. The third piece of news dropped a huge boulder off the man's soul. He really did qualify as a bone marrow donor. So in the end, he was the one who had to experience all the delights of a bone line on his arm in order to have that very bone marrow borrowed. However, he was not frightened by the pain after the surgery, which was brutal, nor was he frightened by the prospect of immune disorders and other things that were promised to him as side effects. They couldn't drown him in the river, though they tried. What fears are there after that? Reflexively losing his left hand, the man stopped in front of the flower store window. Immediately his thoughts ran to the wrong place. For some reason, the evening in a row passing by the store, he thought, what kind of flowers love the woman who replaced his children's mother? Believe me, she doesn't eat flowers. A familiar and irritatingly snide voice came from behind him. What do you mean? He didn't turn around because he could feel himself blushing. Don't make us blind and stupid, the girl whispered. We can see how you look at her. And to simplify the process, I tell you, flowers she does not eat. Candy and cake drag also makes no sense. With her work, we're already going to get diabetes, and all 4 of us, but to buy good meat for us. Pickling and invite us all to a kebab out of town. At the weekend, it is sure to appreciate it. Just trust me. And you're not mad about it. I'm well aware of how disgusting it can look from the outside. Alex suddenly burst out into the open. Disgusting. Gross would be if you looked at me that way. He shuddered. That's why you were running away from me like fire at first. The girl stood beside him shoulder to shoulder, turned her head to the side, and told him there was a sad story in the next town a couple of years ago, and we had a couple more cases too when either relatives or acquaintances. My mom was showing me all this at the time when I started arguing that it was no big deal if some acquaintance was giving me a ride home. It turned out that can be scary. So since then, I do not particularly trust people. You're doing the right thing. Alex gave a little chuckle. It's better to learn from other people's experiences. Learn from mine. For example, I still have a headache sometimes. So at least climb the wall, but still it is everywhere. They say that when parents find someone, all children think it's a betrayal. Betrayal is if their mother were alive. He would go from her to other women. or if Vendi first took us in and then gave us back to the orphanage for one of her suitors. That's betrayal. But as it is, you're both single and you both like each other, so we don't mind. What makes you think she likes me too? Because you're the first person who's ever been allowed in our house, and the first person who can talk her into going out, and the first person she lets pick her up from work. Dad, it's obvious shish kebab, you say? Alex decided to take his daughter's advice and persuaded Vendi to visit her and her mother in the village next weekend. It was strange to call Margaret Mom, especially now that the truth was known to both of them. But at the same time, Alex liked doing it. His birth mother had long ago ended her life in the gutter with another bottle on her knee and her arms, and this woman had about as much bad luck with her son as Alex had with his birth parents. Yes, and it was her lies that saved her, his life as it were. So to be angry at his grandmother, much less refuse her now, Alex did not. As it turned out, he had a mother and the children's grandmother who had already entered into the taste and the whole family and imposed them warm socks and mittens and even funny, though very warm scarves for the winter time. It was not a shame to invite guests into the house now either. Even during his life as James, Alex did his best to put the place in order, and he reinforced the roof. He put up a normal fence, and every year he tried to do his best. Earlier the doy was more like a wreck. Now it turned into quite a decent dacha with clean curtains on the windows, and no longer a staple looking for a porch underfoot. On this porch sat Vendi, while Alex nearby took the meat. The children, meanwhile, were helping to harvest, that is, picking apples and sorting only what for compote, what for the table, or for jam. As if on purpose tried to stay away from them with Vendi. Can I have a word with you? Sent all the meat on a skewer. The man washed his hands with water from the column and walked over to the woman who had been sitting on the porch the whole time. He had noted even before what had happened that Vendi was very beautiful, and how could she not be when she resembled Manny's sister? But, of course, no thought of her as an Alex woman ever crossed his mind. I wonder if the children were right, and did she really like him, or else? Well, tell me, I've already said 5 anyway. She used to guffaw. It made her different from many. She was very quiet and kind and modest. Vendi, on the other hand, was the exact opposite of her. And it was the opposite that Alex liked, too. After all, he himself did not like to think that he was looking for a replacement for his wife, and Vendi's behavior allowed these thoughts to be considered complete absurdity. You don't have a fiancé, do you? Why do you ask? Why do you usually ask these things? Not now. How will you confess your love to me? The impudent look from the lowered lashes caused a strange mixture of fear, excitement, and the very feeling he once had for the quiet and shy Manny. What if I did? Can't you drown me in the river? We tried that once. Didn't work. Unless you try to burn me now and make me burn with shame by refusing. But I can live with that. I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. The woman stretched out in her usual left-handed tone, and then her voice became serious. It's not because we look alike, is it? We are alike, in some ways, waved Alex. No, it's not. At first I was just grateful to you, and I respected you for what you did to my kids. Then you know how much time we spent together, and I used to know you even though I didn't know you that well, plus with 3 kids. Who else would want me? Only the same madam with 3 principals. Isn't that so? And how serious are your intentions? He got down on one knee and with one fluid gesture took a box with a ring from his pocket and opened it. He was dumbfounded. He was dumbfounded. The woman looked at the ring with round eyes, as if she could not believe what was happening. We are actually only talking about shish kebab said. Rings are usually given at the restaurant. Oh, thank you. Without you, we weren't aware of it. The habitual hit came back to the faith instantly. I see the kids today decided to spoil the whole romantic thing at this point. What else are you romantic? You have 3 kids each. Threw in a laughing Dan. So Mom grabbed the ring, grab Dad, and take him to the registry office before he changes his mind. Oh, my darling, that's a wonderful idea. And before the registry office, we should... Grandma Margaret came out on the terrace and wiped a 5-liter bottle with her sleeve. You know we don't drink. But children do, all the more so. Cute, so it's classy, and even under the shish kebab. And I didn't keep that shit of yours at home, and I won't keep it. You know me? I know. The laughter of children and adults rose again over the porch. Alex put the ring on Vendy's finger and, deciding that now was a good time, leaned over the woman's lips. There are children here, aren't there? There was a protesting squeak. We're not 5 years old. Let's kiss quietly, Alex responded for all of them. And they kissed. The common room was as usual, crowded. The nurses were discussing everything. And the first thing, of course, was the change of surname. For the first time in their lives, their Spikes sounded jealous. But far from the first time, Vendy cared about it. Vendy, did you really get married? A colleague who worked for a long time in another department of the clinic, and only yesterday came back to her former place of work, decided to find out everything, as they say, firsthand. Really? Well, how did he take the fact that you have 3 children? 3. She arched an eyebrow. Well, you had 3, didn't you? That's right. Only I have 4 children. You were invited to take my place just for that reason. I'm being transferred to paperwork from today. Well, in 6 months I disappeared for a year and a half. You'll just work for a while, and then I'll be back. Aren't you bored here much? She tried not to sound sincere, trying not to laugh in their faces. All those who time and again discussed her personal life, or rather, her lack thereof. All those who tried to talk about the wrongness and fallacy of her choices and her decisions. Those who thought she was crazy, abnormal. And her decisions, those who thought she was crazy, abnormal. There were other words they called her. That was it. And now who is crazy? Who, anyway, didn't matter what they thought in the past. The important thing was that they were all living together now. Vendy, the children, Alex, and even Margaret's mother, and that they will soon have another member of the family. I've already decided what we're going to name it, Alex said, first thing as he picked his wife up from work. Vendy fidgeted, making herself comfortable in the back seat, and with her seatbelt fastened, she said honestly, I have no idea, and I've got an idea. Well, spit it out. What did you have in mind? Idea generator. You look it up. We have Vendy and Nancy too. There's still love left. Isn't there? No, we already have it, of course. But I mean, you could name a girl that... Good idea. Vendy smiled, turning away from the window. She thought sadly of how she'd never been able to voice the idea, to name the girl Minnie. She certainly wouldn't hold it against her, though. Maybe she'd been watching them the whole time. Even if she had, she wouldn't be mad at Vendy Alex, much less the kids for wanting a full family, and ended up pushing them towards each other. She would just be glad that they were doing well and would now be well forever.